sample taken by Travis Audacity. Pretty sure they don't really know what they're talking about.
Hello, Laura.
Hi, SJ.
How's it going?
It's going good. It's going good. I'm really feeling this Mars retrograde in my 7th house.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my 7th house too.
You're Libra. We're both Libra rising, right?
Yes.
So hopefully we'll get into the significance and the meaning of Mars retrograde in this discussion. I was reading through your email and you mentioned analysis paralysis, and I'd actually never heard of that applied to astrology before, but I was experiencing it in coming up with topics for you and I to discuss today because there are so many. And I'm so interested in your work and the subjects that you cover on your new YouTube channel. I was watching all the videos and taking notes, and it's extraordinary, the amount that you cover and how well you explain things. That's probably one of my biggest weaknesses, is that I just don't have that ability to explain things simply.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I mean, it's, it's always a task of trying to get all of the information that's out there and then try to figure out what jumps out and then to communicate it in a way that maybe people can grab onto, or to narrativize it.
Right.
So that it can be kind of useful for folks. So it's one of my favorite things about the astrology work is that we have the opportunity to do that because there's so much information to pull from. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll get into that. But first, I'd like to introduce you. So I'm Laura London, and this is a special quarantine edition of Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for the 11th edition in this series is Hellenistic astrologer S.J. Anderson, somewhere along the banks of the Danube River in Budapest, Hungary. A native of Austin, Texas, he has spent his life studying astrology, Theravada Buddhism, and Sivananda Yoga. He is a lifetime member of the International Society of Astrological Research and writes ongoing commentary on the movement of the planets, guiding others through cosmic joys and vicissitudes. He finds this regular taking stock of astrological influences has been a highly effective tool for grappling with our complex times. He is the author of the Thema Mundi, 33 CE, and the Death of the Light of the World, published in I Am Infinity Astrological Magazine, issue 28, Queen, and The Great Stellium, a cycle of planetary copresence, published in issue 23, Mythos. SJ posts weekly videos on his YouTube channel, SJ Anderson, where he shares his screen filled with his astrological charts and meticulous research. Please visit his website, sjanderson144.com, for links to his YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and to book an astrology or cartomancy reading. And visit our website, speakingofjung.com, where you'll find links to everything that is discussed in this episode in the show notes. This episode is being recorded on Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020, through the magic of Skype. Hi again.
Hey.
Hi.
Wonderful to be here, Laura. Nice to see you. Nice to hear you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, we're not doing video, and you and I, in the past, when we've talked, we've had the video on so that what you do so well is you share your screen, and you do that in your YouTube videos, which I love, because you're not just explaining things, you're showing it on video. And that's kind of new to me because I'm much older than you are, and I was really into podcasts. I'm still into podcasts, which is all audio. So I typically listen to podcasts when I'm doing things with my hands, when I'm washing dishes or chopping vegetables, or, in the shower, or I used to drive when I was driving. And now most things are on YouTube. And I started posting this podcast on YouTube very reluctantly a few months ago, and I'm not sure I'm going to keep doing it because it's just the audio and I don't want just a blank screen. So I'm putting some photos, I'm accompanying the audio with photos that change every 19.5 seconds. And I don't know if people are interested in that. I don't know why anybody would want to listen to a podcast on YouTube when it's available on all these other platforms. And I even make it available to download for free. So, but what you do, the visuals are really important. So let's talk a little bit about, I don't know if, so why I mentioned analysis paralysis is because there is so much to cover with you. And I like to follow my guest. I do have all these notes, but I'd like to talk about what you want to talk about. So do you want to start a little bit with how you became interested in astrology? Do you think that's relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
That's certainly relevant. And, my story, I guess, I'm from Austin, as you mentioned, and I grew up there right in the Austin area. And, I had a kind of a tough childhood, lost my mother when I was 11. I have a family history of alcoholism, and so I inherited that gene. And so my early life was quite a struggle dealing with and grappling with those kind of those inheritances.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to get too personal. I don't know if you were wanting to go quite that deep.
That's quite all right. You can go as deep as you feel comfortable with.
Okay, cool. I just think it's relevant. It's very relevant to because I see astrology as really a spiritual practice in a way. I mean, it's a way to understand the world that we're in and sort of explain reality. And I needed answers after kind of struggling with such, painful experiences, and then just trying to figure out how to function as an adult. That was a difficult process for me. And so I turned to the spiritual path very young. About 2019 is when I really kind of had to, get right with God, as it were. That's when I found Theravada Buddhism. And I spent a lot of years in my early 20s going over silent retreats and studying with various teachers in America. And I actually heard about the Saturn return for the first time during those years, probably about age 23. I was living in San Francisco for 2 months, and then my roommate mentioned something about a Saturn return. And then astrology, it was kind of around the surfaces, but I didn't become a serious student until about 10 years later, after my own Saturn return. Mm-hmm. And by then, I'd been a serious meditator for a long time, and I'd been a cartomancer and a tarot enthusiast, and studied that quite deeply before I became an astrologer. The thing about the tarot is that it's involved in zodiacal symbols and planetary symbolism for interpretation of the cards, at least in terms of the modern way it's read, like post-theosophy. Those correspondences were kind of established for the cards. And so I learned those correspondences, and then I met the astrologer Jen Zart on a kind of a whim through some mutual friends of ours. We went to a music festival in Boise, Idaho, and this was in 2016. And just like 3 or 4 minutes of talking with her, we exchanged not very many words, but it became very clear to me. She kind of opened me up. I kind of see her as like a initiatrix. She was kind of like this mystical being that just kind of cracked open my vision in a way. And from that moment on, I've been just obsessed with astrology and been a serious student, and now a practitioner and astrological counselor. And I'll tell you what she told me. This is what opened everything up for me. She said Jupiter has a 12-year cycle, and that Jupiter will be in the same spot in the zodiac every 12 years. And that just turned something on for me, because in my personal life, I had some really intense 12-year cycles. Mm-hmm. And particularly with like a love affair with a woman that kind of returned 12 years later out of nowhere. And I was just kind of reeling from that breakup, and it just opened everything up for me. I realized kind of, and this is a key point, I think, for my like astrological ontology, or kind of how I understand it, is that these cycles are very operative in how the reality manifests. And so once I saw that, it not only took pressure off and gave me a great sense of relief that I didn't have to hold on so tightly to reality, like make things happen or try to understand things, that I could kind of let go of some of that and give it over to the planets. And so once I saw that, it was I just dove in, head first, and I'm still diving. That initial dive is still going deeper,
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. I love all that. I hadn't heard that story before. I'm going to jump in because there are two things I'd like you to define for the listening audience. You mentioned Saturn return. Just very briefly, what is a Saturn return? And then I have another question.
Okay, yeah. So Saturn is a planet that moves so we have a zodiac. Let me just break this down. There's an ecliptic. That's the path that the sun travels in a year, according to how we perceive the sun. And we divide that into 360 degrees. That 360 degrees is divided into 12 30-degree segments. And those segments, we assign a zodiac sign. So your listeners have probably heard of like Aries, Taurus, Gemini. They probably know, what they so-called are according to modern sun side astrology. So for Saturn to move along that ecliptic, and it doesn't move exactly on the ecliptic, it goes off of it a few degrees above or below it. It takes Saturn 29 years to travel that same space from our perspective that it takes the sun to travel in a year. And the Saturn return. So when anybody's born, Saturn is at a certain position in the zodiac, and 29 years later, Saturn will be at that same position. So it happens around age 29, roughly, for everyone. This is the kind of so-called Saturn return. I was going to say maybe the feared Saturn return.
And what does it symbolize?
So Saturn, to understand the Saturn return, you can just look to the what we call natural significations of Saturn. And there's a rich history, a symbolic history, narrative that goes into analyzing what Saturn might mean. But just to put it short, it could be things like struggle, discipline, austerity, separation, isolation. A lot of times people could look at a Saturn return as the struggles of becoming an adult. So the way I think about it is there's like this verse in the Bible. It's like we put down childish things. I don't know the Bible too well, but I've heard that quoted a lot. And we basically pick up adult things. The way you can look at the Saturn return is that Saturn requires us at about age 29 to go into that next phase of our lives where there's maybe more personal responsibility. Austerity, I think, is a good word for it. And you can think about midlife. Most people are mid-career. They're having to make ends meet. If they have families, they're responsible for other people. That's also a natural signification of Saturn in the ancient texts, is being responsible for children, sometimes other people's children. Mm-hmm. So it just marks a transition into adulthood, and it happens around age 29, and we use that Saturn cycle to time that transition.
And people can find out exactly when their Saturn return is if they have their natal chart, and you need obviously your birthday, but also the exact time you were born, and not everybody has that. Most people do. It'll most likely be on your birth certificate, but not always. In that case, you can ask your mom. But having that exact minute of birth is very important. So, for instance, my Saturn is placed at 14 degrees, 44 minutes Pisces. So when Saturn returned to 14 degrees, 44 minutes Pisces, that was the timing of my Saturn return. So another thing that you mentioned, or a person that you mentioned, Jen Zart. Sorry, I always have trouble with her name. Her last name is spelled very unusually, and I will have a link to her website in the show notes. Jen and I were the guest of Chris Brennan on his wonderful astrology podcast. That is my favorite, if I might say, astrology podcast. It is called the Astrology Podcast, and it is available to stream or download for free from their website. They'll be provide links to all of their things in the show notes. But Jen and I were Chris's guest to talk about Liz Green's book, Jung's Studies in Astrology, Prophecy, Magic, and the Qualities of Time. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I'd like for you to now pick up where you left off after you met Jen in Boise in 2016, but you also know Chris. So I don't know if you want to get into that too.
Yeah, it's funny because like the circle's complete. They've come back around because Chris is my primary teacher. Mm-hmm. And shortly after I met Jin, I went home and I spent about 2 months. I just went to all the public libraries in my city. And that's a tip out there, kind of a hack for anybody who wants to study astrology. There's a bunch of free astrology books in your public libraries. Yeah. Start there, find the ones that resonate with you. But I did that for a few months. And then I found through Facebook, when I was on Facebook, through actually the friend that Jin's art was with on that trip that we worked together, I became mutual friends with him, or friends with him on Facebook. He posted a link to the Astrology Podcast.
Nick?
And that was the first time I had ever seen that Astrology Podcast. Oh, the friend's name, I can't remember his name.
Was it Nick Dagan Best?
It was not Nick Dagan Best.
Okay.
These were not astrology people, actually.
Okay.
She was the only astrologer there. And so it was kind of outside of this world that we met. That's why it was sort of strange in a way.
Yeah.
But so it was a link to an episode about Saturn being feminine, actually. Yeah. So it brings us back to Saturn. And there was this whole ancient idea. There's a few texts that point to Saturn having a more feminine quality. Ancient astrologers like to divide planets by gender. And so there's kind of debates around that, and they explored that in that video. But I found that podcast, and instantly when you listen to Chris and the people he has on, you can just tell how smart, intelligent, how intellectual astrology is, and how, I mean, these are serious people with a serious intellect, bringing that to bear onto astrology. And so it's if someone's more inclined to that model, I highly recommend Astrology Podcast. I was. And I pretty quickly got involved in Chris's courses. And by the end of that year, I had finished his course and got the certificate. Almost exactly a year to the day from meeting Jen, I got my certificate from Chris finishing his course. And it's a very intense course. I mean, I studied with all of my free time and blew through that course. And
so no, let me just jump in again. That's a Hellenistic astrology course, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, he's got a course, his main course, and I haven't checked out his offerings recently, but yeah, his at least then was this Hellenistic astrology course, and I think he's got some other courses now, but I still think that's his main, the beef of his teachings are this Hellenistic astrology course, or is this Hellenistic astrology course, and it's an amazing course. I mean, we read many texts. It was more complex and demanding than most college courses I took. I mean, there was homework and tons of reading and hours of lectures. You go to Chris's lectures, it'd be like a lecture on the houses, and it's like 20 hours of audio, literally.
Yeah, and so, Chris does also offer some free downloads. His episode with Lisa Scheim on zodiacal releasing, I think, is 4 hours long. And that's a free download. But I just also want to mention that Chris published a book in 2017 that's titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. And it is, I think, the first real kind of textbook on Hellenistic astrology published in English. Is that correct? Do you know?
I think it's definitely the most comprehensive treatment of the subject. And I recommend that book to everybody and anybody. And for me, that's a textbook I refer to a lot. The best thing about the book is he's got citations to everything. And so if you can also obtain the text he's citing, if you're wanting to go a little deeper, you can refer to his citations and then go into the text and explore those texts further. But yeah, the book is amazing. Chris is a very generous person and highly recommend his work. And yeah, he's a huge influence on me. So that's where I was kind of christened in or brought into this field, was through Jen, just by this moment of flash, and then Chris through heavy duty scholarship with him, and study with him. So.
Chris I think he's just in his 30s, right? And I think he's going to be one of the world's leading astrologers in the future. And I also wanted to mention, I don't know if now's a good time, that you and I were both at the big astrology conference that takes place, is it once a decade or twice a decade? It's called the United Astrology Conference, or we call it UAC. And it just so happened to be held in Chicago in 2018, and I live in Chicago. Where were you living at the time?
I was living in, Austin at the time, but I had been in Thailand the year before, and I came back actually to America. There were some other factors, but a big reason why was to attend UAC, because I knew that was going to be taking place, and I wanted to be sure to get there. And I think it's every 4 years, 3 or 4 years is what I've heard. But we'll see with this new the new normal, just what happens.
Right.
What happens. But we don't have to launch into that just yet. But yeah, I was excited. I mean, kind of why I bring that up, because it kind of feels like a closing of an era in a way, with having these large gatherings and this real celebration of the global community. The ease of traversing borders in the old style, that I'm not too sure when that's coming back. So, if we're talking about every 3 to 4 years, that would be 2022. To me, that's a little optimistic to have that kind of free flow across borders ready to go for the next UAC. And I know they were planning it in 2022. I'd heard some rumors. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to just see what unfolds there. But yeah, just to go back, we met there, and I remember you because the thing about UAC, it can be very intense physically. And I just told myself I'm going, but I'm going to sleep when I want to sleep and wake up when I want to wake up. I didn't do it like some other people, which is just go, 20 hours a day for a week and then crash. And so we had some messages, but I think we just didn't cross paths, and some of that's probably me because I was sleeping or, taking care of my physical needs.
Yeah, I don't know that we knew each other. I think I found out about you after UAC, but because of UAC. So for me, I'm not a practicing astrologer. I'm not a professional astrologer. I did study formally back in the late 1990s and use it pretty much every day, but I don't practice it. So I didn't go as a professional. So what I did, they needed volunteers and they needed people who knew Chicago because there were people coming in from all over the world. And I found out about the conference through Chris because he was he was mentioning it on the Astrology Podcast for about 2 years leading up to the conference, that it was going to be held in Chicago. And so I had it in the back of my mind that I should probably attend. And when it got closer and registration opened, it was incredibly expensive to attend. And I thought, whoa, I don't know if I want to do this, but there's some friends that I wanted to see, and my astrologer, Robert Hand, was going to be there. And I wanted to meet Rick Levine in person because we were on a show together, but we hadn't met in person yet. And of course, I wanted to meet Chris Brennan. So I registered as a volunteer, and they gave us a huge discount. And then they provided us with MP3 downloads to cover the small entry fee that we did pay. Anyway, so I would not do it that way again because I missed a lot of stuff because I had to work. And as much as I enjoyed working and helping people, there was a lot of standing around and there were a lot of talks that I missed. Yes, you can get the MP3 of the talk and even the PDF files that accompanied it. But it's not the same as being there. But I did really I did meet Chris Brennan. He was one of the first people that I encountered on that first day. And we saw each other and he gave me a big hug. And then he's like, hey, can you watch my equipment? So he had to go upstairs and get some stuff. And he and Lisa set up and recorded interviews there. They recorded video interviews. Yeah. So I just want to mention a few other things that I did get to meet Rick Levine and spend some time with him. And he was my guest on the first quarantine edition of this podcast back in April. That's available on the website, speakingofjung.com. And I met Gary Caton and Darby Costello and Howard Seltzer and Ina Stanley, who ran the online college where I first started taking astrology courses when I mentioned back in the 90s. So I thanked her for that. And Robert Hand was there and all these greats. And that's how Chris was kind of promoting it, that we don't know when this collection of the world's greatest astrologers is going to be under one roof ever again. So, were you at the taping? So Chris Brennan does this once a month forecast episode of the Astrology Podcast, along with the astrologers Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees. And that's available, again, on their website. It's free to download once a month. They go over the coming month and what's going to happen. So that taping was moved to a bigger room. They're like rock stars. It was so much fun. And I forgot where I was going with this, but I'm going to let you talk. I need to shut up and tell us what your experience was of the conference.
Okay, yeah, and I will say I wasn't at that taping. My experience was very, it was amazing. I met the astrologers going in. I had sort of set some intentions. I want to meet this astrologer, this astrologer, this astrologer. But once I got there, my daily planning was non-existent.
Right.
But I got to meet Ben Dykes, who was one of my teachers. I consider a teacher. Robert Hand. I attended his lecture. I met Chris. I got to attend a lecture with Rick Tarnas.
Yes, I was at that too. Yep.
Yeah. So it was a real, I just loved it. Yeah, I loved being there with astrologers. And even though I talked to some close friends that I had known before the conference and got to see them and meet them for the first time. I'm just trying to think what I could say about it. I mean, I'm glad I went, and I'm glad I got to experience the teaching, from teacher to student in that same room. I think there's something powerful there, and just feeling like Robert Hand's energy and his kindness and his generosity. His lectures are amazing because he actually just reads charts. He'll take volunteers and he'll do little readings, as many as he can get through. That's kind of how he lectures. And so that was nice to see him do some chart reading. I learned some things I still use today from him actually during that lecture. But yeah, it was wonderful. I mean, I guess part of my so I intend to go again if it's easy enough to get there. I do think, though, we're now in an age where we have these kind of lectures available online, and they are available. I mean, you can get Rob Hand and Ben Dykes lectures on their websites that are as good a quality as the ones that were at UAC. And so it's just to say, I mean, it's like it's necessary in a way for certain things, but in some ways it's not necessary as well. Not
necessary, but I'm just going to jump in again.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
That the human connection and seeing people in person and looking them in the eye and just being in their presence and feeling their energy, I really, really enjoyed that. And yes, I too was at the Rick Tarnas lecture, and Chris actually took a picture of him, and I'm in the shot, and there were so many people in that room. People were sitting on the floor. And so it's just this strange picture because you're like, why are these people sitting on the floor? And people have bags and books, and the energy is something you can't do online, and I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, Ray Merriman's lecture. Were you at that about Uranus and Taurus, the financial astrologer? Yeah. So that's something that I'm going to miss because I don't know when that's going to return. But yes, online is wonderful.
I mean, for the knowledge, if you want to get the knowledge, that's really, it's available online. But yeah, the human quality of it and like the rock star concert feel of it, that's not going to be really as available online. And we can talk about that some too, of just like the world we're in now with everything's on Zoom, and there's these Zoom meetings with like hundreds of participants, and you can't really see people, and you have to scroll through screens to see who's there, and maybe their pictures aren't up. So yeah, there's a whole morass, I think, that comes with human connection and the group feeling of the online world that, certainly the UAC is much better along those lines. I would agree with you for sure. Go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just going to pick up. Yeah, I was going to pick up where we left off with your personal story of how you got involved in astrology. And we sort of left off with you taking Chris's courses, and then where did you go from there?
So I took Chris's course, I got the certificate. And I mean, this is one thing I just want to encourage other students of astrology. I mean, at a certain point, you are your own astrologer, you have wisdom. Everybody has inherent wisdom and something unique to add. And I feel like that's kind of what happened to me, is that I studied, Chris's work. I read the texts, I read the ancient texts, and it wasn't like a line that's crossed before and after, but at a certain point I was making connections with ideas that I hadn't really seen made before, and then gaining confidence in my own ability to make those connections and add ideas to the community and to the, ongoing astrological discussion. And, my practice is, so I guess what I'm saying is there was a transition for me into my current practice, which is unique. I practice in ways that other people, no one in the world does, just because every astrologer is doing that.
Right.
There was a thread on Twitter recently. This astrologer, Pallas Augustine, I'm not sure that's her handle on Twitter, but she was saying that some of the debates on Astro Twitter, which is the community on Twitter, sometimes we lose sight of just how nuanced and individual each practitioner is.
Yes.
And that's really falling into that, finding my glove and then trying it on and then it fit. That was such a just an opening for me as an astrologer, and I felt pushed into that, and then I felt confident to just. You become one, I guess is what I'm saying. It kind of happens to you, and at a portal that was opened by Jinn, and then I was sucked in. There was leading to something, and I feel that distinctly at this moment. Even it continues to lead to new insight and. Every time I open an ephemeris or my software, there's always something really fascinating happening. And I feel like it's speaking through me and through other astrologers to kind of deliver messages to the present, whether that's like publishing something on Twitter or a podcast or even in a client setting. That's what it does. It gives hopefully useful or meaningful messages to people. And so once that started happening, that's when I felt it just feels wonderful to be that kind of conduit. And I say that with all humility, but, you're looking, like, I'll give you an example if you want. This was from this summer. This was an amazing thing that happened. Like the 5th June 2020 lunar eclipse. It's the first eclipse in the Sagittarius Gemini axis. So for the listeners out there, eclipses happen in new signs about every 2 years. And this eclipse was the moon was closely conjoined this fixed star called Saturn, and it's in the Hercules constellation. And that constellation is depicted as a man kneeling on one knee with a club, Hercules. So like this violent person taking a knee. And that week in the world was, all that was being discussed was take a knee. The protesters were taking a knee. The cops actually were taking a knee. And so it was this really magnificent, reflection in the sky of what was happening on the earth. And that's just one example. That happens over and over and over again. The more you look, the more you can experience that, And so that's what keeps me going, this kind of opening of the sky. And this isn't anything, the techniques help. The techniques very much help. The studying helps. It's like learning a language. I got a vocabulary. I understood the words. I understood how other people have put the words together. But at a certain point, you begin writing your own, paragraphs. And so, that's kind of a summary to bring it up to the present. I know I don't really feel like I skipped over anything huge there. I did publish those articles you mentioned, but that's, in the same vein as what I've just described. It was just ideas and connections that were made and that I then put into an article. And we can certainly go into those too. Those are so fascinating to me. I never tire of talking about it, but I don't want to jump there because let me just turn it back to you there. I'm curious about this summer for you too, with what happened. Even in that moment, did you see that? Did you see people saying, take the knee? You were aware of that kind of meme or that phrase that was kind of took over?
Not this year. I was, when it happened in the NFL, but I didn't actually know about that happening this summer. But my question, my question to you though is, and I'm just probably wasn't aware of it. Honestly, I don't pay that much attention to the news. I see it because I'm on Twitter, and that's really the only place I see it. I don't like explaining why. I get pushback from a lot of people as to why I'm not up on what's happening in the news. I do that for my mental health. So I do want to ask you though, when you were talking about that, the fixed star Saturn and on a knee, and then you seeing that reflected in what was happening, I'd like for you, because you explain things so well, To tell the listeners who don't really understand astrology, or some of the skeptics out there who say or think that we as astrologers are saying that there's a cause to it and that the stars, the planets are causing things to happen on Earth, and people don't like that. And that's not what we're saying, is it?
So I was actually thinking about this on my walk. I was just out and I walked back here to my computer to get on the call. I was thinking about this exact question because this has also been something going around recently. People saying, which camp are you in, causes or signs? So that's how the ancient astrologers, at least how Chris teaches it. And I've been through the texts, and I don't know if those distinctions are as clear, but I think it can be a useful just teaching tool. So are the stars like signs, so symbols in the sky, but they don't cause anything? Or is there a causative, feature of the movement of the planets and stars? And my answer, as soon as I heard this question posed, 5 years ago or whenever, I thought about it deeply. And I came to the conclusion that I don't think it matters which side you take, because I think that even if there's signs, someone's sending the sign, presumably. I mean, the sign, it's like a street sign is controlled by someone who programs it, or, even just a sign in a yard that someone puts to support something. So at some level, there is a causative actor. And then, so there's either signs reflecting that cause, or the stars are the cause themselves. And so I guess what I'm saying is this question, what's more important to me here is what is the causative, actor in our reality? What is that? And that's where you get into these really kind of higher metaphysical conversations and to me, you have to go there. I think at least my astrology has to start giving that some time and some thought, and at least trying to work my way around that before I go deeper. And so for me, I think there is some kind of God or God realm. I know you had Miguel Conner on recently, and I tend to be partial to that worldview, that there is a higher kind of heavenly realm, whether it's the pleroma, as they say in the Gnostic realm, or other like Vedic models. But there is this kind of godly realm. And then what happens is that the material reality is kind of encased or held in that larger, reality. And I'm just speaking my own language here, so I reserve the right to rephrase or refer to other texts or something like that. But basically, the stars and the planets are then they're part of our material realm, right? Because we can see them. And so they manifest in our material realm, but I do think they're somehow connected to these higher and unseen realities. And I think the idea of an unseen reality to me is extremely important. And I mean, I've had dreams, I've had non-local communication, let's just put it that way, with other people. And, so I've seen it. I know there's an unseen realm. And, David Bohm and other new physics folks have showed it in the laboratory. So I tend to go there with it all, that there's these kind of mysterious unseen elements to reality. And I think that would explain probably how the stars operate on our material realm, whether they cause or whether they're just a sign. But we don't really have the vocabulary or a complete understanding of that to be able to even answer the question. So that's kind of my, yeah.
That's a great point. For me, what makes sense to me today, and of course this could change, because we know we have ephemeris, right? We know where the planets are going to be in a month, in a year, in 10 years. We know where they're going. It's not like we don't know where they're going, so we don't know what's going to happen. We know where they're going, or where we're going, really. So how do I want to say this? I do bring Jung into this a little bit because of his concept of synchronicity, which is acausal. One does not cause the other. They occur simultaneously, but one doesn't cause the other. So for me, what's happening in the sky is a reflection of what's happening on the earth. It's a reflection. They're occurring simultaneously, but one is not causing the other. So if we were taking a knee this summer and up in the sky, there was, what was it? There was a lunar eclipse conjunct the fixed star Saturn, which is taking a knee. So, and I want to get into activation. So because that eclipse was occurring at the same position as that fixed star, how does that equate to it manifesting physically on Earth? So again, I look at that as a synchronicity, as an acausal event. That's just the way I look at it. I don't think that they cause things to happen. I think that they show what is happening. So I don't know if we're going to get into fate and free will, but I see those very differently today because of my study of transits. And this is all very complicated. And another question is, I know I dumped a lot there, but in the beginning, I wanted you to define Hellenistic astrology. And I hope people aren't screaming right now saying, what the hell is Hellenistic astrology? But how does Hellenistic astrology differ from what, at least here in the United States, we're used to seeing, which is modern astrology, right? Where most people have seen a sun sign column in the newspaper or in the back of a magazine. So what is the difference?
So let me answer that kind of quickly, but I do want to come back to this other topic here if I could, because I think I have something really important to add there.
Oh, okay.
So can I just come back to that first, and then we'll come to the Hellenistic
Any
astrology
way you'd
question?
like to do it is fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to go back, because the other thing that's really influenced me is the tradition of astrological magic is the term that is used currently to describe it. But this is a medieval, maybe in Arabic, so like the end of the first millennia and into the second millennia. There was a tradition of making objects during the time that the planets were aligned in certain ways, and making these objects that then hold the power of that alignment. And so, and I just, without going into too much detail, I've seen that to be very powerful. And so, and the theory behind that is just that the objects in the material reality actually are constructed kind of energetically with the same substrate as the planets in a way. And that's kind of strange terminology, but just that you can examine an object. So these astrologers would have correspondence tables. The dog is like Saturn, iron is Mars, love is Venus. And so you would work with these alignments to bring into the material world something that reflected the energy of that planet. And so I just want to say, from my work in that space, I do think there's something a little bit more connective in terms of the substrate of the material world, connected to the planets, as opposed to just being more of a reflection. But I'm down with the reflection too, don't get me wrong. And the tarot work and the cartomancy work I've done, it's very much about synchronicity often, because that's sorting randomly symbols. And it's just uncanny how those random generated symbols can speak so clearly as well. But so anyhow, I just think that just to add that to the conversation, the listeners can explore that if they're more interested. But there's this whole tradition of the planetary energy of material objects and how to change the material world through these astrological alignments that does imply something a little bit that's more causative or kind of one to the next in terms of working with the building blocks of reality. So do you want to say anything on that, or should I jump to the Hellenistic astrology question?
I wanted to mention, and I was just looking it up, are you familiar with Caitlyn Powell's company, Sphere and Sundry?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I am familiar with her. Absolutely.
Is that along the lines of what you were just talking about when you were speaking about astrological magic?
Very much so, yeah. They call it materia. That's a popular term, and that just means the materials that you make when these alignments happen. You make objects, and then you have like a consecration or a ceremony that the energy of that moment then is contained in those objects, such that those objects can be taken into the future and bring that energy into future moments when those planetary alignments are different. And that's what she does. Yeah, she makes materia of all kinds, oils, candles. I don't know her full offering, but I've seen the stuff on Instagram, and it looks quite comprehensive and quite high quality. I know a lot of my friends use her products, and they really recommend it. So that's exactly what she's doing.
Okay, great. Yeah,
the theory there, but it's the theory is what I'm interested in, that you can kind of retain the planets into the future through objects. But sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you for explaining that, because I know about Caitlyn because her husband, Austin Coppock, is one of the 3 astrologers that do the monthly forecast on Chris Brennan's podcast, the Astrology Podcast. And so I am friends with her on Facebook and on Instagram and on Twitter, and I see the lovely, beautiful quality of the work she does. And I will provide a link to her website in the show notes. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but the company is called Sphere and Sundry. Spear and Sundry, Talismanic Offerings of the Celestial Variety for Practical Magic and Magical Practice by Caitlyn Coppock. So yes, we recommend Caitlyn's work. And then the other question was about Hellenistic astrology and what exactly it is. And I didn't know about it until I came across Chris Brennan's work, because the astrology that I learned was the modern day astrology, the Placidus house system, the tropical zodiac, and 10-degree orbs. And it's been very difficult for me to unlearn a lot of that, but I choose to. And so tell us, if you would, what it is.
Yeah, I think one short answer is just that it's not altogether too different from what we have in the modern setting, and that is to say that kind of, in a way, it actually gives credence and kind of builds the reputation of Hellenistic astrology, that what it created is still with us. I'd say 70%, 80% even of the modern astrology can be found in the older texts. So the planets, the significations of the planets are largely the same. The house significations are pretty much the same. There's a few changes, but that's the same. The aspects are largely the same. Where it gets different is in just like, so you can take those 2 of those topics that you mentioned, the houses and the aspects, in terms of the technical side of how those are applied. The Hellenistic astrology can be quite different. But in terms of the big picture, it's somewhat the same. So that's my short answer. But yeah, I can speak like on the houses. The key thing is that the Hellenistic system does not extract from the ecliptic, the division of houses. And so it leaves on the ecliptic the division of the 12 astrological houses. And so each astrological house is comprised of a full zodiac sign in the earliest tradition. And that's a lot of astro speak, but I'm not sure how else to say that, just that we divide. So in astrology, we have 12 houses, which are just, they're topics of life, like children, family, career. We also have 12 zodiac signs, which we were referring to earlier: Aries, Gemini, Taurus. And in the modern system, you can have an astrological house that contains more than one sign. So you might have your first house has some of Aries and some of Taurus in that house division. Whereas in the older system, Aries, all 30 degrees of Aries, will fill the 30 degrees of the first house if the ascendant is in that house. And I will say that I use this house system partially because my teachings with Chris, what I learned from Chris, but Robert Hand is really the most influential person for me in adopting this house system. And I would encourage everybody to read. He's got 2 papers that are available online where he really goes into the ancient texts. He goes into the translations of Ptolemy and Firmicus, and he really, explains how the older or so-called first house system operated. And just people should know there's still debates about this, but I'm confidently on the side of this system called whole sign houses was the first system. And so that's the big difference, one, of the ancient system.
I want to jump in
Go
there.
ahead. Okay.
I just want to jump in there. So I was saying that I studied astrology in the late 90s through an online college that still exists. I'll provide a link to that as well. And they use Placidus house system. And then I started getting personal consultations from Robert Hand way back in the year 2000. And he had just switched to whole sign houses. And I thought, oh no, I am so used to looking at my chart using Placidus houses. So it was very confusing for me, but he was pretty adamant about whole sign houses. And so I switched, and I can't go back. It makes the most sense to me, this whole sign house system. But yeah, that's something about astrology that's been difficult for me, is that there is no, I'm still kind of a black and white thinker, and there is no one way, there's no one right way to use astrology. There are various house systems that are used. And sometimes I think of it as, well, maybe it's like religion, that it's all pointing to the same thing. It's just different ways of looking at it. So I just wanted to add that, but go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's a whole thing I really would like to talk about too, is the variety of astrologies that are operating in the 21st century, and how exciting that is. I will say, just quickly back on the Hellenistic astrology thing, the elegance of using whole sign houses, things kind of fall together for me with that system in terms of aspect theory, and that was the second thing I wanted to mention. That the other big feature of the difference in the Hellenistic system is that we use what are called whole sign aspects. And it comes from the affinities between the signs. So like people know that Cancer is a water sign, Scorpio is a water sign, and the signs are divided up into the 4 elements. So you have 3 signs of each of the 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. But we use aspect theory in the ancient system because of affinities between the elements, and there's other ways we can categorize signs too, the modes and gender or sect. And so that the aspect theory, not only do the houses comprise a full zodiac sign comprises a house, but also the aspects rely on the zodiac signs. How the signs interact with each other or have affinity to each other is how we actually get aspects between planets based on the signs they're in. And so there's this elegance where everything kind of comes together. The planets, signs, and houses and aspects all sort of merge together in a very elegant way. The modern system really kind of untangles those things, and it's its own very powerful system. And the modern system of Placidus houses or quadrant houses and orbs for aspects, you can find the antecedents for those in the Hellenistic texts, but they're just not made prominent. They're kind of exceptions. So an astrologer will be like, well, let's look at this technique. Well, what if we did it like this in this one way? And then later, one paragraph will be extrapolated into a fully formed quadrant house system by a medieval tradition. So anyhow, that's a long-winded way to explain that, but people can research it earlier. Just type in whole sign aspects if you're curious about that, and whole sign houses. Those are, according to my view, the 2 biggest differences between the modern and the Hellenistic system.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you mentioned a fixed star, and I was not trained in fixed star astrology. That's something that came later. But do you use fixed stars?
I do. I use them every day, and increasingly so. Mm-hmm. I find them, just to be like this example with the fixed star Saturn. And by the way, congrats on not being as keyed into the news. I think you've probably saved yourself a lot. You maybe added years to your life on that, but. I think, that's just an example of the kneeling this summer. There was a fever pitch for like 2 weeks of kneel. Everybody was kneeling and kneeling and kneeling, and just as this conjunction happened. But I've just seen it to be, if we go with the reflection model of astrology, that the star activations get reflected into the reality. I mean, it just happens over and over and over again. So that's because of how powerful they are. And I see it in the natal chart too. So someone has the chart of the planets and stars when they're born. Often a planet being near a fixed star can can come through quite strong. Like Princess Diana had her moon conjoining the fixed star Algol, which can imply decapitation or just maiming of the body. That's a kind of darker example, but there's many. And then
examples. Did that let's stay on that for a minute. Was that activated at the time of her death? Do you know?
I haven't done the transits or I haven't looked into that, and I'd like to, and I should. I'm going to put that on my list because I should. I mean, that's worth exploring, most definitely. But the moon is the body, but no, no, it's a great question. I don't have an answer to it.
Let's talk about the difference between natal astrology and the world events, mundane astrology. You do look at mundane astrology, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd say those are the three areas that I'm primarily practicing are natal, mundane, and electional.
You and I follow each other on Twitter, and you were tweeting about some world events. And remember I said, really the only place I get my news is on Twitter. And for instance, you have covered things not just in present day, but I've seen you tweet about things that have happened in history, and you don't just write your opinion, you actually will include a chart and show exactly what you mean. And that's why I really respect your work and like how you do things. So do you want to bring up some examples of, well, let's first say how everybody has a natal chart, which is kind of a snapshot of the sky the moment you were born, and you need obviously your birthday, and as I mentioned earlier, the time that you were born and the location. And there are a lot of websites out there that will calculate your chart for free. You don't have to have astrology software like the astrologers have. I don't know what you use. I have Solar Fire on my PC, but on my Mac, I actually love Ephemeris and recommend it. It's not very well known, but it's the best one I have found for the Mac. So there's the natal chart, but then there are charts for events and for countries, right? And we call that mundane astrology. And then electional, I just wanted to define each, and then you can talk about them. And then electional astrology is the timing of things, right? The finding out, doing some research, finding out, picking a time to take action when it would be most beneficial. And there are some rules to picking an electional chart. And I actually used one of Chris Brennan's electional picks for the month that I wanted to start this podcast. And I'm always going to be grateful to him for that because it's 5 years running and we're still alive. So I'll let you go.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting because we just hit 5:03 where I am, and I guess that's 10:03 there in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And just this moment, the moon has passed into a degree in the sky where the moon is giving Mercury some relief because Mercury is under a lot of pressure right now, opposing Aries and making a square to Saturn. And the moon has now come in to rescue Mercury just this moment. And I was thinking about this for this recording because the first hour was dealing with that heavy pressure. But at this moment, for the rest of the talk, the moon is now protecting and kind of breaking up the attack on Mercury, if you could say. Nice. And that would be an example of electional astrology where we look into the future. We say, I want to take an important action like start a podcast or get married. I did some marriage elections recently. And you find, okay, when will that in chart, for the moment that is most important for the action. So for you, it might be pressing, I guess, releasing your first episode. For a marriage, it could be saying, I do. We look for what's that one action where you really can't turn back. Mm-hmm. And we try to time that action to have a very auspicious arrangement of the stars. It relates to the magical practices we were talking about earlier, because in those practices too, you have to find an election of an auspicious alignment to then do the ritual. And I think that we could even take it back a layer further. there's this principle in astrology of inception, the inception of something. And even natal astrology is an inception chart for someone coming into the world. That first breath when the spirit enters the body, that moment we capture with the natal chart. And so that principle, it's just using that same principle for every part of life, not only the birth of a human being, but the birth of anything, like a nation, like a business, like a podcast. So, in a sense, there's this through line between the various branches of astrology of trying to capture that an instant that something is born. And then we use the chart from there. But mundane astrology, another way to look at it too, is just the astrology of the world, the astrology of the events that happen in the world. So it could be nations, it could be natural disasters. It's big scale happenings. And that can rely on inceptional astrology, we might say, if we're going to use the birth chart of a country. But that can also just be strictly transit-based, where we just say, well, Saturn is in Capricorn. That is the home of Saturn. So the zodiac sign Capricorn is a place where Saturn is very strong. So we might predict that the world might be under pressure or might have to deal with authorities or Saturnian, restriction during a time when Saturn's strong. Maybe even a better example is just looking at the transit of Jupiter through Capricorn, which in Capricorn, Jupiter can be quite weak, right? It's the planet of expansion, having to go through a Saturn's home that's very cold and restricted. And we saw in 2008, the financial crisis then and the crash of the stock market. That was when Jupiter was in Capricorn. And then Jupiter is now in Capricorn and has been in Capricorn since December 2019. And we've seen the stock market's, bounce back, but the, Main Street economy has really suffered during this passive Jupiter in Capricorn. And that didn't rely on an inception chart. That's just looking at the transits. Where is Jupiter in the sky now? And what does that mean for how events on Earth may unfold? So mundane, I guess to just conclude that, has different ways to go about it.
It's such an awkward word to call that branch of astrology mundane astrology. And I always hesitate before I say it because it's such a different use of that word, mundane, right?
Well, yeah, mundi, if you think, I guess it's the Latin, the world. It just means world. So I think that's where it comes from. And I'm not sure how that, through the years and through the linguistic development ended up being a word that just means something, I guess, common or, every day. But I think that's helped me just to realize it's like Thema Mundi, the birth chart of the universe. Yep. That's the Mundi astrology, kind of the astrology of the big picture, or, something like that. Mm-hmm.
So an example of that, did you want to use an example of, I keep mentioning to you the Beirut explosion because of the tweets that you did that were so insightful, looking at it astrologically. Yeah,
and I'll give a quick one that's also with this Saturn thing I mentioned earlier, because so that lunar eclipse was happening at 15 Sagittarius, and we have a birth chart for the United States. It's called the Sibley chart, where it's I guess some people are saying the Sibley time, but then the chart is for DC. Sibley made a chart for London using a certain time for America. But if we use that time for the signing of the declaration, it's a very popular chart that mundane astrologers use. It's like 13 Sagittarius, I believe, for the degree of the ascendant for America. And we had a lunar eclipse at 15 Sagittarius conjunct Saturn. And this was something where you saw, like, politicians. There's a picture that was going around of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and all of the Democratic leadership were kneeling in the Senate, socially distanced. Really? This was right around that same week. Everybody was kneeling. And the other thing is that it's struck at the heart of America. So the ascendant degree is the degree of the self, the degree of the kind of essence of whatever has been incepted. And so this eclipse happened right at this very important place that would say, well, this is going to speak to the heart of America, or the nature of the American self. And I mean, this summer, and the other thing to say about that lunar eclipse, Mars was at 15 Pisces. And so there's only 4 degrees in the zodiac Mars could have been at to activate this eclipse. And it was at one of those degrees, 15 Pisces, making a square difficult or kind of a dynamic square aspect. And this was the same week where all of the protests for the George Floyd, situation, those protests exploded during this week. So it was the heart of the American self kneeling all the way up to the state houses. They were kneeling. Everybody was kneeling. Everyone in the public sphere was, selfies kneeling on Instagram. And so that's one example of just how powerful this is, using an inception chart, that is the USA Sibley chart, hitting that very important degree, the 13 Sagittarius, the eclipse of 15 Sagittarius. But yeah, and so then later, more recently, we had Jupiter and Mars made the first of 3 squares. And so I'll mention this aspect again. It's where the planets make a 90-degree relationship in terms of their position on the ecliptic. And so if we have a circle that's 360 degrees, 90 degrees, it's like if you were to draw a square within a circle. There's 4 points on a circle. Each of those points are 90 degrees apart. When 2 planets hit those 2 of those points that are next to each other, that's a square. Jupiter was making a square to Mars. Jupiter in Capricorn, where we had said it was weak, was making a square to Mars in Aries, where Mars can be quite strong. And the way you think about Jupiter, sometimes it's a big planet, it's expansive, it's airy, it's fuel, really. It makes things grow. And so this difficult square to Mars, it was like fuel to the martial fire. Mars is the planet of fire, the fiery red planet Mars. And in the ancient texts, they delineate it as fire. It's known to be a hot planet, like scorching hot. And in that moment where the square happened, it was literally on the day that the aspect became 90 degrees, these explosions all over the world. It was Beirut, and there was a meme going around that was like, here's the 7 explosions all on the same day. And those meme creators didn't understand. It wasn't an astrology meme. This was just like a alt-web meme or something. But the astrology, it was you couldn't delineate it better. Explosions, many explosions, as many would be Jupiter, big. Explosion would be Mars. Yeah.
And large and Jupiter expands things and makes things big. Or if maybe I shouldn't use the word makes because of what I said earlier, it's reflecting what's happening on the earth. But tell me how else that can be looked at. How do you see it? I see it as, I do think that the substrate of physical reality actually is made of something connected to the planets. And so each individual being, that's what your birth chart is. It's actually like the recipe of you. Like you're this percentage Mars, this percentage Jupiter, and so everything in reality has a planetary recipe. And so when those transits activate certain parts of the makeup, it actually, I do think there's some kind of I'll probably get, excoriated for this when people hear this, but I'm like a cause and symbol sign guy. Okay. I'm all of it. I'm an everything. Okay. I'm a fate and no fate, a cause and no cause. I like it.
I'm like, let's embrace the paradox, embrace the contradiction.
Yes. I love that.
You can think about it as like an antenna. Like, let's say, they did the CIA and MK Ultra did these experiments, and not to get controversial, but this is like public record.
Where'd that come from?
Dr. Delgado, he put the nodes in the brain of the cow, and then they would turn on the node, and then that part of the brain would be activated. I think that's a good analogy where
Wait. Stop. Start at the beginning. Okay. That sounded really interesting. Okay. Dr. Delgado, who's that?
So Dr. Delgado, he's an infamous doctor who worked for the CIA in the 50s and 60s. Those dates, it's definitely the 50s, okay. I think the 60s too, but people can look that up. He is known as being one of the doctors that were hired by the CIA for their MK Ultra project. This was a project that they were studying mind control, MK, mind control. And again, I think it could go back to a German word, actually, control in German, and it starts with a K. But these papers were found in the early 70s. They were brought before Congress and the church committees in the early 70s. And this was the whole expose on, clandestine studies and operations of the CIA. They hired hospitals. There's an infamous one in Canada that they hired. What's the big university in Montreal? the big, it starts with an M, I can't think of it, but it was a doctor affiliated with that. And they would run, mind control operations. LSD was involved in it. I mean, this is a matter of public record. It's not controversial.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought of the analogy because the Delgado is famous for putting a wireless like chip in a bull's brain and then effectively remote controlling segments of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And this was 50 years ago they were studying this. And so I just was trying to think of like, it's more about a remote activation is really what I was trying to pull from that.
Okay.
Just that the planets, if they're activated in the sky, so when Jupiter and Mars are squaring, it's like they're getting turned on in the transiting sky.
And so I think what I'm missing is, because I do know what MK Ultra is, and there are people who have accused me of being a monarch. But with that aside, what is the connection with astrology? I think I'm missing that part. I
was more just an analogy.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not making any kind of a claim that MK Ultra somehow used astrology.
No, but an idea of how astrology, quote unquote, works, right?
Yeah.
Likening it to that, I miss that connection.
Okay. So let me say, I think this might help just going back. Like I remember how I said objects in the material reality are actually made up of the elements of the planets. Let's just say it like that. So you're 5% Saturn, 20% Mars, it's like if we had a recipe of you, and I mean literally like the material substrate of your physical form is made up of this planetary kind of clay, let's say. I mean, we want to use that analogy. So let's just try that hat on for a second as a metaphor.
Okay.
So when the transiting planets then get activated, it would simultaneously activate the part of your material form has that planet's ingredient.
Got it. And did we define activation? Because we've used that word a lot, and I don't know if some of the listeners might not say, well, how does something get activated?
Yeah, so activation would be like this summer, if we go back to this fixed star Saturn analogy. This is kind of a minor star, actually. I'm glad we got to talk about this because this is one of the most shocking things for me of the year. I remember seeing that and it blew my mind. But that happened. So the moon, the degree of the eclipse, 15 Sagittarius, was Saturn is within a degree of the eclipse. I think Saturn is 15 Sagittarius as well.
And fixed stars don't move in the sky, right? Planets
they move slowly.
Right, very slowly. Not a full degree in our lifetime, right? Or do they?
If you live 72 years, you might see a full degree. Okay. Yeah. So it's about a degree per human life.
Okay.
They're slowly moving, but it doesn't have to be maybe the main point is that the eclipse happened on the degree of the fixed star activating the fixed star. Let's say the eclipse happened.
Right.
Well, the eclipse happened in the square to Mars as well, because Mars was at 15 Sagittarius. So Mars was activated. And a way to think about this, and this was in some of the notes we were passing back and forth, but the syzygies, these are the oppositions and conjunctions of the sun and the moon. The syzygy is like an astronomical, it's a concept where you take three bodies, and it's when those three bodies line up. And so in the case of the syzygies of the sun and the moon and Earth is the third body. So when you have a full moon, the sun, moon, and Earth are in an alignment with the Earth in between the sun and the moon. And when you have a new moon, the moon is in between the Earth and the sun, but it's an alignment of those three objects. That's what a syzygy is. And these have been important for astrologers all the way back to Ptolemy, probably before. I mean, Ptolemy, there's a quote. He says, if you want to see how things then unfold, look to the syzygies. That's going to tell you how things unfold. I like to think about them as like a strobe light. Like if you're dancing in a club, it goes on, you can see people, then it goes off. And the syzygies are the moment when that light is on. You can kind of see what's going on. Or you can think about it like a drum beat in a song. It's that background that keeps the music grounded, and so these are extremely important. So one way to think about activation is when the syzygies happen, what planets are talking or seeing the syzygy by these geometric relationships, what we call aspects. So we're mentioning the 90-degree relationship, that's the square aspect. And this summer, the fixed star Saturn was making an exact conjunction, so same degree, and Mars was making a 90-degree exact aspect. So those were two that were quite activated by the syzygy.
Right. And I don't think we also mentioned the different aspects. There are difficult aspects, and then there are easier aspects. And the difficult aspects are the conjunction when they're at the same degree. The square is a 90-degree angle, and the opposition is a 180-degree angle, if you will. And then the easier aspects are the sextile, which is a 60-degree angle, and the trine, which is 120 degrees. Is that correct?
Yes. Okay. Yes, that's correct. And there's some debates about conjunctions. Sometimes people say they're easy aspects.
Yes.
But yeah, that's it. And, there's also, like Rob Hand, there's the whole thing in his book, Horoscope Symbols.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he talks about this in Planets in Transit too. But, sometimes the difficulties are actually the hidden good. It's the hidden good aspect is the difficult aspect, because that's how we grow. Like I talked about my difficulties early in life. That's actually brought me into the kind of rich life I have now that's very, healing and sustaining and, but I had to go through difficulties to get there. Some people don't have that, and not that they're better or worse, but just sometimes the gift is in the pain and the suffering. That's the way we develop empathy, right? I mean, going through a difficult experience allows us to have a heart connection for other people in pain, so I do think there's something to be said that the difficult aspects can be good, but yet it's not fun going through it. Like if you have an explosion all over the world, 7 explosions on the same day, that's not fun, for people that were really affected by that, So, and that's another point here is that as an astrologer, sometimes we're looking at maps and representations, and it's worth saying that there actually is a lived embodied experience of this stuff. And these are maps. This isn't the living. That's just maybe a better way to think about activated. Like the activated is the person in that moment experiencing something, So just worth saying that. Sometimes I feel a little removed from some of this stuff, and I don't want to be too cold. I want to be like even this summer with the rioting and the protests or however you want. I don't mean to be rioting to be pejorative. That's a problematic word, but the unrest, let's say. Okay. There was a lot of suffering that went around that was part of that. And so it's worth just, pausing and acknowledging that. I feel like I need to, I get excited about this Saturn fixed star conjunction and the eclipse. It's like, all right, there was some real intense stuff going on for people,
So the big event that's coming up astrologically is what's called the big conjunction, or is it the grand conjunction? It is Jupiter and Saturn aligning in the sign of Aquarius on the winter solstice. So December 2020, this happens about every 20 years, and it is quite significant. So what can you tell us about this upcoming Jupiter-Saturn conjunction?
Yeah, so it's very, very significant, the Great Conjunction, and it's something that medieval astrologers and Arabic astrologers developed techniques around, and these techniques deal with every 200 years, Jupiter and Saturn will change the element of the sign that they're conjoining in.
Right,
so they make a nice triangle in the sky. So they go from in zodiacal order. So we will have an Aquarius conjunction in 2020. We'll have a Gemini conjunction in 2040. We will have let's see, what's next there? A Libra conjunction in 2060. And it just moves by triplicity in zodiacal order. And sorry, that's 20 years. 2040 will be Gemini, 2060 will be Libra. And so the significance is that this shift of element happens once every 200 years. And when the Great Conjunction changes elements, they call that the mutation conjunction, where we mutate into a new element. So the last time we had a mutation conjunction was in 1804, I believe, or 1802, early 19th century, when we went in basically to a great age of Earth. So it was in the Earth signs of the zodiac, and we developed things like the steam engine and the railroads. Oil came into existence during this Earth age, this 200-year Earth age. We really had a revolution in how humans relate to the Earth, right, and the grounds that we inhabit. we're now entering into a period where the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions will be in air. So it's an age of air. And this started actually, it's not always a stark change. Sometimes there's a conjunction in one element and then it goes back to the old element. And so in 1980, we had a conjunction in Libra, 3 conjunctions actually. It was a triple pass conjunction because of retrograde motion. And then in 2000, the true conjunction was back in Taurus. And then now, starting with this conjunction in 2020, these 2 planets will always meet in air signs until 2172, I think, is the date, or 2179. So we have a pretty continuous 150-year period now of air, of this age of air. And the air element is associated with, and Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, I will say, but the air element itself is with zodiac signs, they have various types of rulers. Aquarius and all air signs, Mercury is a ruler as well as Saturn are 2 of the rulers, 2 of the primary rulers. And so what this tells me is just that this age we're in, and you don't need me to tell you, just think about what's happened from 1980 to the present, the changes we've seen in the world. And the biggest one, the most obvious one, computers, right? And then the internet, and then now the AI. So that's just, I think listeners should be aware that there's this really great shift of the ages happening. You're living here in it, and you're on Earth to witness it as computers sort of seep in and take over more and more of our reality and the digital connectivity. And it's kind of a warning, as well as the promise or the offering, because the technology can be we're having to find our way through it. Let's just put it that way. And I just hope we can sort of avert the worst case scenario or become sort of technological captives, and how can we retain the soul, the humanity, the human spirit? How can we enliven that spirit, quicken that spirit with the technology being part of our reality? I think that's the great question that we're, poised to answer. And Mercury is the planet of divination and astrology and magic. And, I think that there's something to be said that we will have to kind of, give more magic into the reality. And I think the kind of ensouling, as Richard Tarnas says, we need to become ensouled. And I'm hoping that if we can carry that sense of being ensouled, that the soul is here in the material, and that magic that's implied by that, if we can bring that with us into this computer age, I think we'll be okay. But if we lose sight of that, and I think the scientism can sometimes run the risk of demeaning the human form, where we're just merely like one. I was talking about in my video, Ray Kurzweil says that humans are just a notch. We're just like one little notch in this chain of some kind of like digitized apotheosis or something like this. And I think we need to just make sure to celebrate, practice, protect our humanity. And that's just what I want to share with folks. But this is the great challenge of our age. And, we're seeing it now. You see people, the cell phone addiction, and even with the COVID-19 and the coronavirus, event that we're all having to traverse and deal with, the ramifications of the response to it have been to increase that technological integration in ways that have been real challenging. I know I was talking also recently about skin hunger. This is a new concept, and people are having this skin hunger because they've been isolated with their computers. And so, I'm not trying to, I don't want to give it's just describing what our reality is. And again, it's this reflection of the skies movement into our reality on this longer term cycle. So, in one sense, we can't be afraid of it. This is a normal, natural unfoldment as we move into this air element, an air dominated, reality. But on the other hand, I think in every age, how do you give your soul food? What are you feeding your soul? Some people talk about prayer and meditation being as necessary as food and water. I tend to think that's true. So, and again, this might sound, we were talking earlier about the unseen. This is why I sort of brought that up earlier, because I really do feel like there's an unseen world that's just as real and maybe even more powerful that we have to feed or give attention to, or else life becomes almost unbearable. And I think, the technology will be the medium through which that suffering manifests unless we are sure to kind of balance it out. So that's just what I wanted to say. I know that's maybe not as much astrology and more preaching, but
okay.
I just wish for people to be healthy and whole and happy, and turn off the phones at least a little bit every day. I use my phone all the time, but I always turn it off for some parts of my day.
Mm-hmm.
You can't meditate looking at a screen.
Right.
So can't go for a walk or run. I guess you can have a wearable, but that's largely free from the computers. So anyhow, and it's coming. And I'll say on that, by the way, when Saturn entered Aquarius for 3 months this year, and then because of retrograde motion, it will move back into Capricorn. But we had a little preview of what this Aquarian moment will be like, and Aquarian age. I deliberately use that article because the Aquarian age has this whole other baggage. But I think it's an Aquarian moment, at least for the next 3 years, as Saturn will be in Aquarius until March or May 2023. And we're having to face authority that can be Saturn with the technology, the mercurial technology. And so and you saw it with Zoom, like a lot of things are on Zoom. I have got attorney friends, they're conducting hearings on Zoom. So like the authority is using the technology to conduct its business. And I remember that moment in March when these lockdowns happened, and almost overnight, everybody was on Zoom. There was all these Zoom meetings. It became very draining. The social life went online. There was DJ sets through Zoom parties where you're alone in your apartment, but yet at a party. So that's a preview of what I think is coming for the next, 3 some odd years. And the sustaining the mental health in a world where it's largely mediated through computers. That is the knot that we're having to untie.
And I appreciate that about you, that you bring in those reminders that I and maybe even some others tend to forget. No, I just was remembering that I interviewed the Jungian analyst Dennis Merritt in Milwaukee last year, and he said that Jung coined the term the New Age, the Aquarian Age. And I wasn't aware of that. When I had asked you about the upcoming Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, I was thinking about the presidential election and how, isn't it the case, I think I saw a tweet from you about this, that every U.S. president elected under a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction did not make it through office, except for Ronald Reagan.
And George Bush. So
well, then it's over because we got two that made it. It's
over. Yeah, the curse is over because remember in 1980, it was the first conjunction in air signs. And so my belief is the curse was broken. This was maybe just an Earth age feature. But once that curse was broken by Reagan and now Bush, I'm not so certain that there will be that the next president has to die in office. I don't think that has to be the case,
That's interesting. That I just want to mention John Hogue, who's a friend of mine. He is probably the world's greatest living Nostradamus scholar, and he's been on countless shows and on television, on radio, and I just recently heard him say he's called the correct winner of the U.S. presidential election for the past 60 years, I believe. And he's saying that whoever is elected this November is not going to make it through office. And I was talking to somebody else, and I won't reveal their name, and this person said, well, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll die or get assassinated. Don't flag me here, an essay, that maybe whoever is elected will step aside or step down and allow the vice president to take over. So that might be interesting.
Yeah, and that fits. And I'll just say I'm on record. I went on record in January of this year on another podcast predicting that the Democrats will win. And actually it relates to the Saturn and Aquarius cycle because the last time Saturn, this is the short justification for it. It's very easy. Saturn was in Aquarius when Clinton was elected, and he spent the first half of his first term with Saturn in Aquarius, LBJ and JFK served during all of Saturn's transit in Aquarius in the 60s. And in the 30s, most of Saturn's transit in Aquarius was when Roosevelt came to power, and you have the New Deal. So the last 3 times there's been these kind of Democratic Party reformers that have been part of this Saturn and Aquarius theme. And the modern astrologers will tell you Aquarius is like cutting edge thinking and, new ideas. And, I think that might fit with this delineation because the New Deal was certainly fresh, new economic policy. The Great Society is what LBJ brought in. And that was during Saturn's transit in Aquarius. Some of that was formulated. Clinton, I think, unfortunately went the other way with kind of deregulating things, but still there's this flavor of Democrats coming in. And before that, the transit before that was Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican, but was a so-called progressive reformer. There was a progressive movement at the beginning of the 20th century that Teddy Roosevelt was, a symbol of. So I think my prediction hinges on that. The other thing it hinges on is that every great conjunction, the last 3, so in 2000, we had a great conjunction. The election was a change of party. It was Clinton to Bush, Republican to Democrat. In 1980, it was Jimmy Carter, Democrat to Republican. Reagan. In 1960, it was Eisenhower, Republican to Democrat, or JFK. And so there can be a sense of a change of party with these great conjunctions. I mean, they really are initiators of a 20-year cycle. And a lot of it, Liz Green, Stephen Arroyo have talked about this. They've got a great book of lectures where they go through these 20-year cycles of the 60s and 40s and into the 80s. And we can just think about it now. Remember back in 2000, we had the 9/11 event happened, and that changed the whole feature of the last 20 years. I mean, it was clearly a different 20-year period than the 20 years before, which were the promise of the end of the Cold War and the rise of computers and kind of the fall of the wall. And then you had, boom, 9/11. And then you have this kind of maybe global security state that's emerged. And then now in 2000, we have, coronavirus, and we have this kind of biopolitical technocratic age that's been birthed. And that's what I think will be the theme of this next 20-year cycle. But I think that the reason why I brought that up is because the idea of Biden stepping down, I mean, they're already talking about that in the mainstream. And Biden has already said he's just going to be a one-term president, I think, even because he's like going to be a transition president is the term I've used. Okay. So I think that would fit at least the news, and this is mainstream news, that you bring Biden in, and there's this talk, and this is disputed, and I don't know where I stand on this, but that he's kind of having cognitive issues. So if he gets elected, then I can see him potentially stepping down, and you have the younger Harris. And there's been some gaffes of like the Harris-Biden administration. They both said that a few times.
Oh, wow.
So, that would certainly fit, that you have. And my prediction is Democrats win. I wasn't as connected to Biden being the president. It's more about just the Democrats. And I think you maybe have him win, then Harris steps in and runs to the finish line and gets to the finish line. But
go ahead.
And just the last thing, you see many, many stories that Biden is going to have to be like FDR because of this crisis, the economic crisis we're in on Main Street that I was talking about earlier. There's going to have to be really revolutionary changes in economic policy because homelessness is increasing and all of the devastation of business as a result of the government response to the virus, that they're going to have to do more to change the economic policy to save the society, And so that fits with Great Society and with the New Deal in terms of the Saturn cycle.
We have 3 out of the 4, Trump, Pence, Biden, Harris. We have birth times for everyone except for Pence. So how I see it, let's put it that way. How I see it is I look at things in terms of compensations, and maybe that's the Jungian in me. But when things, and this all stems from this passage in the beginning of Marion Woodman's book, Addiction to Perfection, is when things get too one-sided, it constellates the opposite. And I kind of think of that with presidents. When things get too much and too weighty, then we flip to the other side. And so I think that maybe Biden-Harris will be a compensation for Donald Trump. And if Biden does step down, Kamala Harris is Jamaican Indian. So we're going from, some people see Donald Trump as a white supremacist. And so we are getting, I believe, if the Democrats win, a compensation for that. So we shall see. And did you cover everything you wanted to about the quote unquote new normal?
I think so. I mean, it's just, I would encourage people to read about biopolitics and technocracy. You can find articles on Wikipedia about it, but it really explains the way of life that we're entering into. The one other thing I'll say, there's an article by the MIT Technology Review that came out in March 17th, which was that Capricorn moon activating all of those Capricorn planets on March 17th. This article came out that day, and I think it's called something like "We're Not Going Back to Normal." And that describes just in more specifics, the technological regime that will be installed over the next few years. And I mean this with respect to travel, like having digital passports in your phone, scanning in places. And it's like China. I lived in China,
Yes.
In 2019 and into 2020, I was living in China, and there it's already fully integrated. I scanned in everywhere. I paid on my phone, scanning. So they're quite advanced into this kind of new technological setup that the rest of the world will be brought into now.
That's interesting you mentioned that about the passport, because I was talking to somebody yesterday about how here in the United States, they're changing the driver's licenses to something called Real ID, and they're not required, but to travel, and I'm used to traveling a lot, they're going to be kind of necessary because you're going to need either a Real ID or to travel with your passport. And I don't mind traveling with my passport, but during this conversation, I mentioned how it just seems kind of archaic to have to travel with a physical passport. How many times have you heard stories of people losing their passport, leaving for the airport, forgetting their passport, having their passport stolen, and how that has put a damper on so many people's trips? And I just it just seems like such a archaic method. And why can't we scan our fingerprint, or I have the retina scan when I go in and out of Canada, so that you don't have to carry a physical book with you? And that China's already doing that. That's interesting. Again, I'm mentioning Dennis Merritt. This was our second episode together, which was at the beginning of this COVID-19 scenario. And he mentioned his daughter who lives in China, or maybe she lives in Hong Kong, and that how they're used to sanitizing things and cleaning elevator buttons and the handrails on stairways and wearing masks, and how here in the US, we're not. And I talked about how when I travel, I bring disinfectant wipes with me. This was way before coronavirus. And I get on an airplane and I disinfect the tray table and the armrests and get dirty looks. And so, yeah, where were we going with this? The new normal.
Yeah, the new normal. And I think these are the kind of issues that we're going to be confronted with it. The one thing I'll add is the Saturn component of this Aquarian age. There's an authority side to this that I think is what can make it even a little bit tricky, where it's like a mask mandate versus just an encouragement to wear masks, and that's, Americans have a whole tradition of, choice and, bodily autonomy, and, these are complicated issues. And so I just think that that's where the rub can sort of come in. I mean, even in China, there wasn't mandates. I mean, I'm talking about masks in particular, but it's just so there's no mask mandates when I was in China, but when, it's the economics are just on the phone. I was like, your credit card, all of your bank is on an app, and you scan to pay everything. That's really the scanning that I experienced. That was the extent of the scanning. It's the economic transactions. And I think that's what we're going to be entering into. But we have this particular problem of the mandate side of it, and that I think we're going to resolve over the next 2 or 3 years. There will be a resolution to that. Either people, and I think it'll have to be a compromise, because there's, Americans are just not going to go along with certain mandates. But they're going to have to with others. And I think some of them are quite reasonable, actually. Once you, like in China, everybody's happy. They love scanning in the payments. No one's saying, well, I want cash, I'm afraid. And you can use cash there still too. But, there's a lot to like about it. I remember being there saying, wow, this is so efficient. And I only carried my phone everywhere I went. I never had anything else. So it kind of simplified things. But there is dangers, getting rid of black markets. Black markets can be good. I mean, in the Soviet Union, you had robust black markets. Well, black markets can go away when you have trackable digital transaction for everything. That's kind of part of why what digitization of the economy is designed to do, is to eliminate black market activity. Okay. And black market activity sometimes can be a lifesaver. Like in the Soviet Union, when you had government grocery stores and allotments, for the bread you could get per day and things like that. Sometimes it's not enough. And so there were these robust black markets where people could get just things they needed. And of course, you have illegal activity that comes with that too. And that's why the governments want to get rid of black market activity. But that's another point of tension. It's like, do you want everything tracked, traced, taxed? Whoever has the power to do that, I think there could be potential for overreach in terms of like banning people if you say something wrong, or like activists get turned off in that system. And I'm talking about on either side. We saw it this summer. There were like activists for both sides that were getting banned from Twitter or turned off from the digital environment that we live in. And so that's the risk of it. If everything's digitized in terms of the economic activity, you get cut out of it if you don't go along.
If you don't go along, yeah.
So, I'm someone, and by the way, this is how I look at astrology too, is just there's always the two sides. And I know that's become even a no-no. You can't say, I like to look at both sides, but I mean, there's energies and arguments for both sides. William Butler Yeats, his father taught him this. You read his biography that he said, now go make the case for the other side. Now go make the case for the other side. And that's the only way truth could be found.
Yes.
Was leaving space for argumentation on both sides and detailed, in-depth, intelligent argumentation. So I encourage that with all this stuff.
I love that. So I'm looking to see what is left in our talk, because we've been recording for almost 2 hours. And I think we wanted to leave it with 21st century astro community. And what do you see for that?
Well, I think there's a nice transition from this idea of maybe restricted borders and restricted travel that may last for a couple of years. That the astro community will have to continue online. And we saw a conference in May, the NORWAC conference was completely online for the first time ever. It was very successful. There was a conference that I went to online. I didn't go to NORWAC, but I went to another conference, and this was the, I think, Queer Astrology Conference. And, I'm a cis het, but I have I just support the community. And this is what I really wanted to get into, was how much I support my astrologer friends of all stripes, of all identities, of all. So not only in terms of like the various identities we can wear that don't relate to astrology, I love them, support all of them. But in fact, the identities we have as astrologers, I'm someone who encourages the creativity with the practice and a variety with the type of techniques that are used. I mean, I found Hellenistic astrology. It's an elegant system for me. I get a lot out of it with my clients and with my own, research. But other astrologers feel the same about types of astrology that are so different from the Hellenistic system. They use different planets. So one thing we didn't mention is in the Hellenistic astrology, we use the 7 traditional planets and the nodes largely. They didn't have Uranus, Neptune, and then Pluto, Haumea. They didn't have those outer planets and dwarf planets in the ancient system, but we do now. We have telescopes, and we can see those and map those. And there's some astrology that really focus on those. Like you talk to Mark Jones and you read his book, It's like Uranus and the nodes and Pluto, I think, are really what he focuses on. And I haven't had a reading with him and don't know his work too intimately, but I know that's the main scope of the work, are these outer planet activations, you know. And so I love that. I want to encourage that. And that's the great thing about Astrology Twitter, the community there on Twitter, is that there is a diversity of practitioners. So I can, I'll be tweeting sometimes, and then there's this overlap with someone who has a completely different focus, and we get to share some commonality. And even for my own practice, I mean, I usually don't use the outers, but I will consider them some, especially for mundane work. And I'm into the dwarf planets because a lot of the people that use Pluto, they're not as open to those other planets yet. So I'm trying to encourage expansion out into the other dwarf planets, because I feel like if we go to Pluto, we have to go to those other planets as well. But, I guess the final point I would just make is just that there is great variety out there, and let's celebrate it instead of keeping gate. That's the thing I'm really I don't like to see. Largely, I try to encourage and not really cast shade on anybody. But the one thing that's kind of my biggest pet peeve is when someone else says, oh, you can't do that, or that's the wrong way to practice. As opposed to saying, well, hey, this is how I do it, and showing why another way might have some validity. I think that's the best way to engage in a conversation, as opposed to kind of keeping gate or to being dismissive. So that's my one pet peeve. But no, I'm very excited about the diversity of thought in the astrological community, the mixing that will take place, the remixes. And I just, I'm as excited as anybody to see where we're going. So it's been great with the revival with Chris's work, and how that has now been revived and then incorporated with other modern techniques, and seeing how people are doing that incorporation is just really fascinating to me.
I love that about you, and I appreciate that about you. So to wrap up here, tell us about what you offer and how people can get a reading from you, and what types of readings you do.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I offer natal chart readings, and that's where we look at the moment you were born, the positions of the planets, and we use that as kind of a jumping off place, or as a lens to just get into your world and into your life. And they can be used for a number of things. Sometimes clients want to go back and look at events in the past to try to understand better what happened. Other times people are looking at what's going on right now, or the immediate year or two. And we just see what the astrological energy, how that's interfacing with the reality. And it's designed to assist people in decision making, to alleviate suffering, to give them greater understanding of their unfolding life. I do electional astrology. So if you have a business you're launching, or a wedding, or want to elect for a certain time, I can help you find that key date and that key time of day to do something important. And then I offer cartomancy readings. These are just pulling cards. I use the playing cards, and then a Marseille tarot deck, and we can just try to answer questions and just get into a divination space, really, where maybe the gods or the divine energy can come into that space and help give answers, using the cards as a tool for that. And then I will say I offer a lot of content on Twitter and YouTube. That's my primary publication vehicle. And I give a lot away. I don't have anything behind paywalls. And so I publish a lot about what's going on with the current astrology, stuff in the near future, stuff in the past, try to give people a sense of just what's happening in the skies. And I feel a certain duty to do that, as just being a public astrologer and someone who's, practicing publicly. So you can follow me there. And my YouTube, I'll just say, will be upgraded. I'm installing upgrades, and soon I'll have a lot of high quality video where you'll see my face. And right now I'm just doing more PowerPoint style presentations, which I love that model, by the way. But I'm going to incorporate my face. I think there's something with the intimacy where you can see someone and get to know them a little bit. And I want people to know me. I mean, that's part of what being in public is sharing yourself and having intimacy, really letting people see you and seeing, so I'm looking forward to that growth. And but yeah, my handle on Twitter @SJAnderson144, Instagram @SJAnderson144. There, it's more my personal life and my photography work. It's more kind of for fun, but the YouTube is YouTube / @SJAnderson144. So the handle's the same everywhere.
And I will provide links, clickable links, in the show notes on speakingofjung.com. All right. Were there any final words?
Just, everybody, love yourself,
Yeah.
And I'm just that, I encourage you. This fall is going to be quite intense astrologically.
Yes, it is.
It's triggering the March astrology we had. We're getting triggered. The elections come in. There's going to be a difficult Mercury retrograde. I just want to, I say love yourself, kind of not really tongue in cheek. It sounds simplified, but I really do think, how we talk to ourselves is so powerful. So I just want to encourage everybody, give yourself loving thoughts as you're traversing real difficulty. It's a real powerful technique. And thank you for listening. And thank you, Laura.
Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Apple Music, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device, simply by saying, Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts or TuneIn. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. So with very special thanks to my very special guest, S.J. Anderson, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to a special quarantine edition of Speaking of Jung.
Or